motion is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable the Treasurer.
Mr Deputy Speaker, last week I had the pleasure of listening to the debate on the Queen's speech in the House of Commons in Britain. And in that debate we heard contributions from the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. And whatever position one may have taken in the particular elements of the debate, one thing that was clear was that there were thought-out positions on both sides of the House. And that, well, just be quiet, will you, for a moment? Just shut up.
Order. The member for Dundas.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition spoke to issues such as Britain's membership of the European monetary system, monetary union, the impact of that on Europe, federalism and the rest. And the response was from the Prime Minister around the same subjects. But in both cases there was structure to their thinking. And later on, when I met the Leader of the Opposition, it became obvious to me that not only that the speech he made was but the tip of a very long iceberg in terms of his own knowledge and thoughts about the structure of policy for Britain and Britain's place in Europe. But to come back to this shabby little debate here, this shabby little debate by this frustrated actor, the Leader of the Opposition, performing like a Victorian vaudeville hall performer, up with all of the antics, and thespian character he could bring to the thing, but without any ideas, without any idea that the requirements on an opposition is to be the alternative government, without any semblance of a policy structure. He refers to his economic action plan. What was it? To take $2.5 billion off tax expenditures and outlays and to pay them as tax expenditures. That is it. As if that would change the character of Australia. To take $2.5 billion off outlays and spend it on tax expenditures. But while doing so, suggesting that they would have the tightest fiscal surplus since 1964 when they opposed just about every measure the government's taken in 7 long years of getting rid of their fiscal legacy. I mean, the sheer indecency of it all. But the fact is, to what point is your change? You're admitting that you wouldn't change fiscal policy, and as the Department of Finance made clear, you would diminish the surplus by $800 million. So therefore, with an $800 million smaller surplus than the government, on what basis could you reduce interest rates? You've given up the option of doing anything about interest rates. You had the chance, and you decided to try and buy votes with the money instead of buying lower interest rates. You had the option of going through your fiscal policy and devoting cuts and outlay to a bigger surplus, but you didn't do it. You decided instead that you would spend it in the classic Liberal tradition, took the sleazy way out to try and buy your way back to office. And now then you're up there saying that we've got no answer on interest rates. And the Shadow Treasurer saying interest rates are a record under us. He's wrong. They were a record under him and Treasurer Howard. Cash rates were 22% compared to 18% today. That's the result. But the fact is, the most indecent thing is, Mr Deputy Speaker, this talk from the Leader of the Opposition about the microeconomy. Now, I swear blind that 2 years ago he wouldn't have known what the term meant. 2 years ago he would not have known what the term meant. Micro-reform, he would not have known what the term implied. And yet the government in 2.5 years has presided over a bigger micro-reform restructuring of the economy than at any time in the post-war years. Let me record the progress of these last 2.5 years in the micro agenda. A cut in the company tax rate from 49% to 39%, the largest micro change of all. A massive cut in industrial protection of 33%, the second only cut since the war, and both times by a Labor government. Reform to textile, clothing and footwear and to agricultural markets. Total reform of superannuation savings and a total remaking of the savings picture with an extension of the imputation system to super funds. The deregulation of the airline system, the total deregulation including air freight. Reforms to government business enterprises. a 40% lift in waterfront productivity, OECD crew manning levels for Australian shipping, reform of grain handling, and finally, but importantly, award restructuring, the first attempt ever by a government to change the nature of the Australian award structure. Now that's in 2.5 years. In 2.5 years. You had 30 and you did nothing in the 30. And now we've got somebody who could barely spell micro up telling us how we're about how we should be progressing the micro agenda, how we should be progressing the micro agenda. And then I've got the member for Wentworth, the Shadow Treasurer, trying to upbraid me because I say macro policy is king. Of course it's king. Of course it's king. Do you think we could deal with a 6% current account imbalance if we still had a public sector borrowing requirement of 7%? If we didn't have an 8 percentage point shift in the savings balance, do you think any micro change would matter in terms of the economy? They both have to go together hand in hand. And which government has put it into place? A Labor government. Now, the Leader of the Opposition thinks that being in office, that it would all fall to him and in some way he could preside over all of this change and he'd finally become Prime Minister. He doesn't understand. It's a hard world out there. It's a hard world out there in the world. A hard world. And Australia's got difficulties. A mountain of debt left with from a structural weakness of 20 years of non-investment in the economy under the Liberal Party. 20 years of failure of investment leading to a current account weakness of 6% of GDP in 1980, 9 years ago. And that's what we're left to deal with. But this is a person who has never held a major domestic portfolio, and when he had it, spat the dummy and resigned on Prime Minister Fraser. Always held a foreign affairs portfolio, swanning around the world, never taking the responsibility for major policy. Never taking the responsibility for major policy. And as I've said in the House before, always happy to come second. Always happy to come second. Always pleased to be in the reckoning but not quite make it. Not quite make it. Like the telltale time when he was defeated by John Howard for the opposition leadership. And they said, but your question was, but you always wanted to be Prime Minister, didn't you, Mr Peacock? Answer, did I? Did I? And that terribly shocking, revealing look on his face. Did I? That is the honest blush of a person without the guts to do the big job. Without the guts to do the big job, and still hasn't got the guts to do the big job. But you think if you just roll into office it'll be okay. It won't be okay. Because the moment you start weakening, the moment we have these empty heads in the Country Party rolling you on policy, like happened to the Shadow Treasurer this week, the markets will kick you to death. They'll kick you to death. In Tokyo, London, New York, these huge markets, we turn over $40 billion in the $8 every day. These huge informed markets will beat you to a pulp. Beat you to a pulp. But you don't understand. You think, oh, the Born to Rule squad are back. We're finally back here. We've told the public we've tried to traffic our way into office on the basis that Labor's had some high interest rates, but we'll be inheriting the crown. This country's got a long way to go to get out of our debt problems given to us by you. By you.
Order.
And the fact of the matter is to think that you should inherit our work after, in the first place, you gave us the problem, and then sit there with someone that's got more resemblance to a second B-grade movie actor than it has a thoughtful political personality, then you're thinking again. You can think again. Because I'm afraid wanting to come second and then finding you've come first will have a very big personality change to Andrew Sharp-Peacock. A very big personality change. And it might fall to sterner people, were it to be a coalition government, to work out where the policy is. But it wouldn't come from the member for Wentworth, who's always believed in giving Australia a recession. Helped Treasurer Howard give us one in 1982-3, because in the end his policy is a weak fiscal policy, high interest rates and a recession to cut import growth and inflation and wages. That's the only policy he has. And the rest of the world would regard that as a non-policy. Because the moment you put any demand on the Australian economy, out pops inflation and out pops imports. And out pops the structural weakness. Only this time it'll pop out with $130 billion of gross debt. With $130 billion. Yeah, dead right, yeah. And you know what'll happen? They'll beat up on you. and beat up on you badly, but unfortunately they'll beat up on Australians as well. Now, the fact of the matter is, Mr Deputy Speaker, this crowd couldn't be a government if they started from now 10 years back to try and it. We've been in office 7 years. They've put no structure together whatsoever. No structure together whatsoever. And what do they finally come up with? They'll take $2.5 billion off the Aborigines and the unemployed and throw it away in a tax expenditure, and then suggest that that's a policy change. But have the indecency, the crass indecency, to talk about how the policy's not working. We've got Access Economics with its list of $90 billion worth of projects in this month's October balance of payments. In this month's October balance of payments, we see a 39% increase over the same period last year in the exports of machinery, transport equipment and manufactures. Manufacturers are growing by about 50% a year now on average, manufacturing exports. When you're around, the whole industry was dying. We're rebuilding our industrial base from the ground up, from the smouldering wreck you left us with in 1982-3 when the factory doors were shutting across the country. And then we hear the talk about compassion for the families who were thrown on the unemployment scrap heap and the children of the families who were thrown on the unemployment scrap heap. But the worst thing is you do it all again, because in your hearts you believe that the only way you'll control wages is with high unemployment. And you do it all again. And what had happened again is then another Labor government would have to come and clean it all up again. I mean, how many times do you think we cleaned up after you during the war? We had to pick you up when Menzies, in his craven cowardliness against the appeasers in Europe, had to be thrown out of office to bail us out of the Pacific War. And then we had to set the game up for you in the 1940s. And then again, in the 1980s, we've had to do it again. And here you are. You think you'll come back, but the fact of the matter is. But I noticed the most amusing part of the debate was from the Shadow Treasurer quoting Max Walsh this morning, saying to us, well, he's telling us how terrible it is house prices have risen in Sydney and how we will be defeated for it. Then he tells us we'll be defeated because they're going down. He's having his argument both ways. That is, he doesn't believe that affordable housing prices and the operation of monetary policy is reasonable. What he believes is he believes that he can just traffic his way into office on a recital of half-truths and prejudices and the rest. The fact of the matter is, Mr Speaker, this government's got the tightest fiscal policy in the country's history. A workable wages policy delivering realistic and competitive wage outcomes. A monetary policy set firm to play its proper role in moderating demand. To lift product growth, the most comprehensive economic reform program in Australian history. Structural reform of the variety I've just mentioned, tax reform, financial deregulation, airline deregulation, oil industry deregulation, ports and shipping, productivity-based wage rises, award restructuring, cuts to import tariffs and a better skilled workforce. The highest investment share in our history, coming from corporate tax rates and imputation and domestic savings, encouraged not only by a massive shift in the public savings balance by 8% of GDP, but by a total change of occupational superannuation, which is, of course, that, along with the budget surplus, is totally changing the face of the Australian savings picture. That's the work of a serious government, and it's only a serious government that can change Australia and keep it changing and protect all those Australians from being beaten to a pulp by the world markets. But imagine if it was here with the Leader of the Opposition standing against the rest of the world, trying to protect Australia from the ravages of that marketplace in the face of Liberal and National Party weakness. We'd be ripped to pieces, and then the antics in the House of Representatives and the thespian tricks and all the rest would count for nothing. I move, Mr Speaker, that this House expresses its concern at the total failure of the Opposition to produce a credible alternative economic strategy, as evidenced by the so-called Economic Action Plan, which would result in a relaxation of fiscal policy, a less effective wages policy, a tighter monetary policy, a no effective mechanism to advance microeconomic reforms, all of which would contribute to a rise in the level of interest rates, massively increasing the level of unemployment and smash the economic fabric and structure of this country.